Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments from the front line as well as this New York Times article about how heavy the Ukrainian losses are because, spoiler alert, they're enormous. Starting out in the Zaporizhzhia front, it has generally been somewhat silent in this part of the front line over the past 24 hours as the weather had not been too great, which essentially cut off all possibilities of offensive operations. However, there is still a lot of artillery and multi-launch rocket system fire, as well as air raids on the Ukrainian positions by the Russian forces. And I specify this because the Ukrainians do not have an air force. Then we move on to the Vremivka ledge area, where the Ukrainian forces continuously attempt to attack these positions, but so far they are unable, as they have been essentially reached a stalemate for the past week, as they have been unable to advance on the Russian positions ever since the latest advance, which was just past the river line to the north of Prognosis on the 10th of July. So the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhzhia has reached a stalemate. I think anyone could agree with that. The latest advance was here to the northeast of Prognosis, and again, it seems that these all come at a heavy cost, and it is questionable how many more of these they can do. We will get back to that later. Moving on to the Avdiivka area, here fighting continues, especially here to the south of Zaporizhzhia, as the Russian forces continuously try to push in these directions, both to the north and to the west, as they try to gain control over the river lines here to the south of Avdiivka, so that they have a stronger flank for when they move against Avdiivka, as there is this village chain here to the northwest of the city, and this area is heavily fortified, so the Russian forces need a strong flank if they want to start any push in this direction. So far we're not seeing too much action. We're just seeing a lot of smaller skirmishes here to the southwest of the city, as Russian forces are trying to improve their positions so that they're able to launch some offensives in the future. As for the Bakhmut area, we see heavy fighting by Vremivka continuously. This fighting has essentially been going on for over 2 weeks non-stop, as the Russian forces try to hold on to the city at all costs. We see this advance from the 4th of July, that is 12 days ago, and since then the Ukrainian forces have been unable to advance on the western part. They have advanced a bit here in the southwest, both on the 4th of July and the 14th of July. However, to the northern part, there's been a lot of back and forth, as the Russian forces are trying to hold on to this trench network at all costs. And this is a very difficult task for them because this trench is specifically made in this area by the Ukrainian forces to give the Ukrainians as much advantage as possible. First off, there is the high ground here by the northwest of Vremivka in comparison to the village itself and the eastern parts. This is the high ground in comparison. Also built this trench network next to a bunch of forest patches. So we see here to the west of it, southwest of it, there's a huge forest line, and to the northeast of it, there's also a huge forest line, and to the north of it, there's also a huge forest line. So these forest lines give the attackers an advantage when they come from the northwestern side and the southwestern side, and they give the defenders a disadvantage when the offenders come from those areas. That is because this gives a poor visibility to the units in these trenches, which makes it almost impossible for direct fire, as the Ukrainians could just use these forest lines to fight for cover, so that when they attack, they can essentially have a good overview over the Russian soldiers within the trenches, as well as the possibility of the Ukrainian forces just launching these heavy artillery strikes on these positions, while the Russian forces will have a more difficult time detecting the Ukrainian forces, as they can just hide within the forests, especially here in the summer, where all of the leaves are wide and spread out, which allows poor visibility for drones specifically, which is the main use of detecting units on both sides. So this gives a huge and significant advantage to the Ukrainians, but the Russians are still able to hold on to it due to their firepower superiority and the air force that they continuously use here in this part of the front line. They launched airstrikes with their fighter jets, as well as Ka-52 helicopters coming in to come with some close air support for the Russian forces in this trench network to the northwest of Vremivka. So essentially, here the Ukrainian forces have many major advantages, but they're still unable to capture this area. So comparing that to the Zaporizhzhia front, where the Russian forces have significant advantages, both in firepower, air force, but also their defenses. First off, they are on the defensive, and second off, they have huge defensive positions that have been prepared over half a year, and these positions are prepared in the best way possible for themselves. So on the contrary to the defenses they've taken over from the Ukrainians, these defenses are very, very advantageous for the Russian forces, especially the minefields here on the front line, because they allow the Russian forces to attack the Ukrainian forces where the Ukrainian forces are unable to attack the Russian forces. So that alone would significantly increase the casualty rate in favor of the Russians, but also the fact that the Ukrainian forces are so far unable to reach the first proper line of defense. They're fighting through the line of defense because we can define the first line of defense to include the forward positions and the minefields. However, they have not reached the first trench line, the first area where the Russian forces are actually present. So this means that with all of the 1 month and 10 days of fighting that we've seen so far, the Ukrainian forces are still unable to reach the first proper line of defense of the Russian forces. And now we go on to the article by the New York Times. Here they come with a lot of different things. First off, Ukraine has lost as much as 20% of its weapons and armor. The rate dropped as the campaign slowed and commanders shifted tactics. So this is a very interesting statement, because this is exactly what I have been saying. If you've been watching my videos from the start of the offensive till now, the Ukrainian forces started out with heavy losses. We saw the tank graveyard. We've seen so many misuse of strategies, and it clearly shows with the lack of experience of these soldiers that the offensive was just too much for an unexperienced force. This is the main argument against the Belarusian army helping the Russian army. That is that the Belarusian army has no combat experience. There's a Telegram channel that covers all of the training and movement of equipment in Belarus, and it states every week that the training exercises in Belarus are extended for another week. This has been going on since April of last year until now, and they keep extending it, and every time they extend it, they claim the Belarusian army are now very well trained, they are very well prepared. However, they cannot engage in offensive operations due to their lack of combat experience. However, we also saw that they changed strategies, they changed tactics, and that is exactly what I reported on as soon as they did it. They stopped using armored convoys to just attack the Russian forces head on. They did a lot of infantry movements. They sent their infantry down to these forest lines. They took control over the forest lines, and then they sent the armored convoys after they had captured these areas with the infantry. However, what this is missing is the fact that due to this strange change of strategy, sure, they lost a lot less of armored vehicles. In comparison to 20% in the first 2 weeks, which this article mentions, they lose 10% of the armor in the next coming 4 weeks. So that is much less casualties in comparison to the start. However, that is just for their armor and their weapons. That is not for their infantry. The infantry have taken significantly higher casualties in these 4 weeks than in the start, and that is due to the fact that they use infantry a lot more. If they use them a lot more, they'll take a lot more casualties. They're essentially sending the infantry first and then following up with the armored vehicles instead of armored vehicles first and following it up with infantry, which they did in the first week. So the first 2 weeks, they received a lot of armor casualties, not a lot of infantry casualties. But since then, the infantry casualties has significantly increased, while the armor casualty has significantly decreased. Now, they claim that they are now fighting a battle of attrition, where they will attrit the Russian forces instead of pushing through and breaking through. However, that is the dumbest idea ever, because the Russian forces have a 7-1 firepower advantage. They have an air force that is actually viable in comparison to the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces' anti-air defense by the front line is, to say the least, not useful enough. So essentially, the article says right here, the grim reality of the situation is that the Ukrainian forces have taken so many losses. They've taken 30% of their vehicle losses. They've taken a lot of infantry losses. And in return, all they've received is, according to the article, 6 miles of territories of the 60 miles that they want. However, looking at the deep state measuring the distance, we can see that south of Avdiivka, they have gained about 4 kilometers of distance, and comparing that to from Avdiivka, the front line, down to the closest area to the SFC, that's 90 kilometers. So this is less than 5%. Then we look at the Vremivka ledge area, with the area which they have captured the most. Here they have captured 9 kilometers, and in comparison to 110. Again, this is less than 10%. So essentially we see that the Ukrainian forces, although they have fought heavily and taken heavy losses, in return, the Russian losses are pale in comparison due to the fact that they are both defending, they have prepared these defenses, they have superior firepower, and they have superior air force. But also the fact that the Russian forces simply have a lot of units on this part of the front line. I've tried counting it, I've looked through all of the forces, the regiments, the brigades, and generally the number does not pale in comparison to the Ukrainian forces. So they're essentially even in numbers. The general rule of offensive is that the attacking force needs at least 3 times as much as the defending force. So this article mentions either in firepower or in infantry, but I disagree. It is in these two combined. So if one side has double the infantry of the other, then the one with half the infantry would need 6 times the firepower to have 3 times as much. You don't need half the infantry and then 3 times the firepower. It doesn't work like that. So essentially, if the amount of infantry on each side is equal, which I estimate it to be, then the 7-to-1 firepower advantage and the air force gives the Russian forces at least a 10-to-1 advantage when the Ukrainians are looking for a 3-to-1 advantage to launch an offensive. This is why we are seeing the total failure of the Ukrainian offensive so far. Unless they take all of their things to focus on one spot and get a 3-to-1 advantage on that specific spot, then they are unable to live up to the rules of the battlefield and actually achieve some sort of success. So far, I would not say they have succeeded anywhere on the Zaporizhzhia front, as so far all that they have achieved is essentially capturing a few fields and going over a few mines. This does not give them victory. This is not going to reach the south. The prognosis for this offensive is that it will fail. The rule is that they will fail. The exception is that they succeed. I'm not saying it's impossible for them to succeed. I'm saying it's very unlikely because the rule says they will not succeed because the Russian forces have too much of an advantage. The only thing that would let the Ukrainians succeed is if the Ukrainian propaganda is true and that the Russian forces have terrible morale, they have terrible logistic systems, they don't have any ammunition and all of these things. Unless that is true, then the Ukrainians will not win. Now, for these 30% losses, the article quotes RX, the one Twitter channel and independent analyst that essentially takes the pictures, analyzes them of the warfare, and counts all of the losses based on photo evidence. However, this means that this is all of the losses that has only been caught on camera. That means there's additional losses to this. That is definitely the case because there's no way that all of the losses were caught on camera. That hasn't been the case since the start of the war, and it's not going to be the case anytime in the future because there's no possibility that every single camera is going to survive, especially because of the heavy focus on shooting down these drones, because both sides know how useful they are, and also because of the fact that there's a lot of long-range weaponry as well that is beyond the range of the drones. So essentially, although there is a lot of the losses that are taken pictures of, it's not all of them that there will be. So essentially, this is 30% confirmed losses. They even asked European and US officials, and they corroborate with this. So essentially, it is confirmed that the Ukrainians have taken 30% losses of the offensive power that has been prepared for this offensive, and it's likely to be more. And in the end, This is going to be a heavy morale hit for the Ukrainian forces if they do not succeed in this offensive. As they interviewed a soldier in this article, Sergeant Igor, everybody's hoping for a big breakthrough, he said, adding a plea that those scrutinizing from afar appreciate the importance of slow and steady advances. So the Ukrainian forces are really betting on some sort of success. They are expecting a breakthrough, and not reaching that would be a huge morale hit. So the Ukrainian forces are essentially in a very tough positions right now, as they have not succeeded yet. They've taken heavy losses, and there's no prognosis for their success. Although it is not over, there's still some possibility, but it's not looking good. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.